Alrighty, welcome back, boys and girls. It's your main math man, Mishank, coming you live from Mayfield, and we're working on page number 2 in that Unit 4 study guide. And it says this: it says evaluate, and it has the expression given, and it has 4x minus the quantity 6 plus x, and then in the denominator it has 3 minus x when x is -1. And so anytime you see evaluate, you want to plug in those values first. And so we're going to plug in where it has -1. We're going to, where it has an x, we're now going to have a -1. And so anywhere where we had an x, we just have a -1. And so we're going to work in that numerator first. And so we do x plus a -1, that should be positive 5. And then we have -1 times positive 4, that's going to be a -4. And then we can subtract those two. And so we do -4 minus 5, that's going to be a -9. And then we do now on the denominators where it can work. So once you get down to where it is a single value, you can't go any simpler. And so now we can move to the denominator. So you do 3 minus a -1, which is the same thing as 3 plus 1, which is going to be 4. And so you should have an answer of -9/4. And a lot of people actually did this problem before, and they were saying, hey, what do we do if our answer comes up as a decimal? Well, that's okay, because if you use the Desmos calculator checking it, you should end up with that -2.25, and you don't see that in the answer choices. But what you can do is you can take those decimals and change, you can take those fractions and change them to decimals, so that way you can see which one actually matched up. And so since -9/4, since that is the same as -2.25, you're good. Alright, in number 6 it says if x equals 4 and f equals -5, evaluate, and then it has x times the quantity absolute value, f squared minus x times f, and it has in the denominator x times f. Alright, so what can we do here? Plug in those values for your variables. And so I'm actually going to plug in anywhere where we had an x, I now have a 4 in parentheses, and anywhere where we had a f, I now have a -5. And so inside those grouping symbols is where I want to work first. And so if we do -5 squared, that's going to be 25. And so then I can do, again, I went from this space to this space, and so I have 25, and I have minus, and I'm going to do this 4 times -5. And so I'm going to get 25 minus a -20. That's the same thing as adding those two together. And so then I get 4 times the absolute value of 45. And since we know that absolute value is just taking the positive, we do 4 times 45, which is 180. And so now I can move to the denominator, which we're doing 4 times a -5, which is a -20. Again, divide those two to get your answer, which actually that should be, believe a negative, yes. So my mistake, I forgot to put the negative sign in there, but luckily we can kind of write it in right there. So it should be a -9, which matches up with what I originally had when I got my Desmos answer. And so again, make sure that you are very careful. Even that one little line can make the difference. And so yes, again, do take your time. Make sure you can practice typing this into the calculator for yourself. That way it makes it significantly easier. The absolute value button on the keyboard is just above the enter sign. Let me actually see if it, yeah, it will be, or excuse me, is right below the backspace. There it is. Or you could just use the absolute value button right here as well. Moving on. Alright, and number 7 is a little bit more complicated, but again, it's actually quite simple. So it says evaluate each expression, then match each expression to its equivalent value. Meaning this, simplify, or plug those values in, simplify it, and then just match the end result to the letter on the right. So what you can actually do is you can kind of use the same expression multiple times in Desmos, and you can just kind of change the values around. Or if you want to show all your work like I did, you certainly can. So again, I'm going to start with that first one. It's I'm going to do 3 squared first, which is 9, and then I do -1 to the 3rd power. That's going to be a -1 as well. And then I divide, or actually I don't divide those two. I want to do that absolute value first, and then I can do, or not absolute value, geez, square root of 4 is 2. Divide those two together, and so we do a -9 plus 2 is going to be -7. And so we say that first one is going to be C. So let me actually type that in, so that way we don't forget. So we can say, let's make this a bit smaller. That's close enough. So we can say that's a C. Excuse me. All right. And so let's see. I believe it's this one. We say -7. Yep. And so you can see, all right, I plugged in my values, and I should end up with a -7, and I know I'm good. Okay. So now let me put this to the side and scroll down again. If you need to pause or rewind, please do. So the only difference between these two expressions is that negative sign, that minus sign. So you're essentially doing the same exact steps except the last one. So instead of adding the -9 and +2, you're actually subtracting those two. So you should end up with a -11, which we said is A. So let me put that on there so we don't forget. And let me show what I ended up with on the Desmos calculator. And so yes, I'm kind of pointing to that negative sign. All you had to do is change that. It kept the same replacement values, but since you're changing the original expression, it changes the end result. All right, so similar idea with the next two. We're gonna now be plugging in a little bit different values. So we're still gonna have that original expression, except now we have x equals 4 and y equals -2, z equals 1 this time. And so again, as you work through this, make sure you're following those order operations. And so I did 4 squared, which is 16. I do -2 to the 3rd power, which is -8. And I take the square root of 1, which is still 1. I divide 16 by -8, which is -2. Add those two together, I get a -1, which ends up being B. And actually, by a process of elimination, you know that you can just have that last one be D, but you want to make sure that you can check your answers. So let me actually do that first. We said that, again, we added those two together, where we only changed the replacement values. So that third one, we ended up with a -1. All right, last but certainly not least, we have our expression here. Again, the only step that is changing is we're subtracting. And so let me show you what I ended up with over here. Again, these replacement values are staying the same. However, the original expression is changing. So you had to make sure that you change that that plus sign to a minus sign. And so you should end up with -3, which gives you the result for a letter D. So again, all you want to do for those is match the expression to the correct value. Again, at any point in time, make sure you can ask questions. You know, if you're working at home or you're out of class, make sure you can use that remind to just ping me on there. All right. Let's see. I believe this is the last section for page number 2. So it says, which of the following expressions is not equivalent to 0? So that means 3 of those that were given are equal to 0 and 1 is not. And so spoiler, it's going to be C, and I can show my work for it. I show, okay, plug in those values. I say, okay, -0.5 times 4 is negative 2, and then negative 2 minus 2 is negative 4, which is not 0, and so that's why we selected that one. And then it says, evaluate each of the following for h equals negative 7. So for each of these expressions, 9, 10, 11, and 12, you're going to have h equals negative 7, but you want to make sure that you're plugging in using those parentheses. So each of these should be different values. And so for that first one, I have negative 7 squared. Well, that's 49. Then I have the opposite of negative 7 squared, which is negative 49. For 11, I have, let's see, negative 7 to the third power. That's going to be negative 343. And then I have the opposite of negative 7 cubed, which that actually got cut off, so that should be, let me make sure I typed that in correctly. That should be a positive 343. All right. Again, you can kind of see you're getting the same kind of value, except it is opposite because that negative is on the outside. All right, so last one on this page, it says a student's work is shown to the right. At which step did the student first make a mistake? And so you're kind of seeing, okay, what did they do as they worked through? And so I can actually go through. Let's actually kind of highlight what we had. How big is this? Yeah, that's fine. Let's actually highlight what they did. So they plugged in their values for the variables. And let's see, okay, they did, let's see, they did the grouping inside the grouping symbols first. So they did 4 times a negative 2, which is a negative 8. That's good. And then they evaluated that absolute value of negative 8, which is still 8. All right, so far so good. And then they said, all right, negative 2 squared, that is 4. And then, okay, on this step we say, all right, furthest to the left, we have some multiplication. And so they did 3 times 4, that is 12. And then they should do 12 times negative 2 next. And that is, oh, that is not 10. So you can see, okay, even though, let's do in red here. So even though they're evaluating negative, or excuse me, 12 times negative 2, the incorrect step is in step 6, because they're saying, hey, they accidentally subtracted, so you know for sure that is not correct. And so that's basically what I'm saying here. I'm saying, all right, step 6, it should be this, and I show the correct steps on the right. And so it should be negative 24, which then you do negative 24 plus 4, which is negative 20. Negative 20 minus 8 is negative 28. So again, notice how that one small little step or mistake can throw you off and completely change your answer.